I wasn't supposed to be home early that evening. The day had been its usual grind: deadlines, meetings, phone calls, and a boss who seemed to take pleasure in micromanaging. I had planned to stay late, chip away at the mountain of tasks that would inevitably pile up again tomorrow. But something nudged me to leave, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Call it instinct. Call it fatigue. Whatever it was, I found myself driving through the humid streets toward home, the air thick with the promise of rain. I usually enjoyed coming home. The house was my refuge, a place where Claire and I had built a life together. It wasn't perfect, whose marriage is, but it was ours. I'd walk through the door, grab a cold beer, and collapse on the couch while Claire filled me in on the trivial details of her day. Sometimes I listened. Sometimes I didn't. But it was a rhythm, a comfort. That night was different. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it, a shift, subtle yet undeniable. The air inside the house was heavy, oppressive, like walking into a room where an argument had just occurred. Only there hadn't been an argument. There hadn't been anything, not even the usual sounds of Claire bustling around the kitchen or the faint hum of the TV. It was quiet, too quiet. I stood in the entryway, the door clicking shut behind me, and let the silence envelop me. I listened, really listened, hoping to hear something that would dispel the unease creeping up my spine. Nothing. No clatter of dishes in the sink, no footsteps upstairs, not even the familiar creak of the floorboards that always groaned under Claire's weight. Just silence. I don't know what drew me upstairs. Maybe it was the absence of Claire's usual greeting, the way she'd call out my name the moment she heard my key in the lock. Or maybe it was something deeper, something primal. Whatever it was, I found myself climbing the stairs, each step deliberate, my ears straining for the faintest sound. Halfway up, I heard it. A groan. Soft. Muffled. I stopped, my breath hitching in my chest. It wasn't a sound of pain or distress. It was something else, something intimate. My mind raced, grasping for any explanation other than the one that immediately came to mind. Maybe Claire had fallen asleep watching a movie upstairs. Maybe she was I couldn't finish the thought. I reached the top of the stairs, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain it would give me away. The sound came again, louder this time, and I froze. The bedroom door was ajar, just enough to let me see the reflection in the mirror on the opposite wall. And there they were, Claire and David, my wife and my best friend, tangled together on the bed that I had shared with her for years. My first reaction wasn't anger. It was disbelief. My mind refused to process what my eyes were seeing. Claire's face was flushed, her expression one of raw passion, completely oblivious to my presence. David's body moved over hers in a way that made my stomach churn, his hands gripping her as though he had every right to be there. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air out of my lungs. This wasn't just a moment of weakness. This was calculated, intimate. It was everything Claire and I were supposed to have, and she had given it to him. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just stood there, watching, every fiber of my being screaming at me to storm into the room, to rip them apart, to demand answers. But I didn't. Why? Because in that moment, as rage coursed through me, something colder and sharper took hold. Confronting them would have been too easy, too impulsive. It would have given them the satisfaction of seeing me broken, and I refused to give them that. So I turned and walked away, my footsteps silent on the carpet. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of what I'd seen was anchoring me to the floor. By the time I reached the front door, I was no longer the same man who had walked through it earlier. The rain had started, soft at first, then heavier as I stepped outside. I barely noticed. My mind was a storm, swirling with anger, betrayal, and something else. Purpose. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Images of Claire and David flashed in my mind, each one more unbearable than the last. But I didn't let the rage consume me. No, I channeled it, focused it. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. If they thought they could betray me and walk away unscathed, they were wrong. Claire and David had no idea what they'd unleashed. And as the rain beat against the windshield, I made a silent vow. I wasn't just going to expose their affair. I was going to dismantle their lives piece by piece. They wouldn't see it coming. Walking out that door felt like a surrender, but in truth, it was the first calculated move in a game they didn't even know they were playing. The rain poured steadily now, soaking into the fabric of the night, masking the fury that burned inside me. My car was parked a few steps away, and as I climbed inside, I sat there, motionless, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. My mind wasn't racing anymore. It was laser-focused. I could have stormed back upstairs, burst through that bedroom door, and let every ounce of rage I felt explode in their faces. I could have yelled, screamed, broken things, maybe even them. But what would that accomplish? It would make me look like a fool, the betrayed husband losing control while they stared back at me, caught but smugly satisfied that I'd been reduced to a caricature of my pain. That wasn't me. Not anymore. I wasn't going to let them see me broken. No, if there was one thing I knew about myself, it was my ability to endure, to bide my time. My father used to say, the best revenge isn't in the heat of the moment. It's in the cold aftermath when they least expect it. At the time, I thought it was just the ramblings of a bitter man, but tonight, those words were gospel. I sat in that car for what felt like hours, though it was likely only minutes. The storm outside mirrored the one brewing within me. Each raindrop on the windshield was like a pinprick, small but relentless, adding to the flood of thoughts and emotions threatening to overwhelm me. But instead of drowning, I latched onto the one thing I could control, my plan. This wasn't just about revenge. Revenge could be impulsive, sloppy. No, this had to be something else, something precise, calculated. They had taken from me the two things I held dearest, my wife and my trust. David, my so-called best friend, the man who'd toasted to my happiness at my wedding, had taken a knife and driven it straight into my back. And Claire, how long had she been living this lie? Kissing me in the morning, making small talk about dinner plans, and then sneaking off to betray me in the most intimate way possible. The rage bubbled up again, hot and thick, threatening to spill over. I gritted my teeth, my knuckles whitening against the steering wheel. But I didn't scream. I didn't punch the dashboard. I didn't cry. Instead, I let it settle, allowed it to harden into something colder, more dangerous. If they thought they'd hurt me, they had no idea how deeply I could cut in return. The first step was clarity. I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. This wasn't the first time they'd done this. No, the ease with which they moved together, the lack of hesitation, told me this had been going on for a while. Weeks? Months? Longer? It didn't matter. What mattered was figuring out how they'd managed to pull it off under my nose. How many nights had Claire lied about running errands or catching up with friends? How many times had David stood across from me, sharing a drink or a laugh, knowing full well he was betraying me in ways I hadn't even begun to comprehend? I didn't know the answers yet, but I would. That was the beauty of staying silent. They thought they'd gotten away with it. Claire would continue her little charade, smiling sweetly, pretending everything was fine. David would keep showing up at barbecues and game nights, acting like he hadn't destroyed the very foundation of our friendship. They thought they were clever, but they didn't realize the game had already shifted. The moment I saw them together, they lost their advantage. And now, they were playing on my board. I finally started the car, the engine roaring to life as the rain intensified. I didn't drive home immediately. Instead, I drove aimlessly through the drenched streets, letting the rhythmic thrum of the rain soothe the edges of my anger. I needed to think, to plan. The beauty of it was, I didn't need to rush. They'd continue their little affair, thinking I was none the wiser. They'd get comfortable, careless even. And that's when I'd strike. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the storm had lessened, though the air still felt heavy. I sat there for a moment, staring at the dark windows of my house. Claire was probably asleep by now, or at least pretending to be. Did she feel guilt? Did she think about me at all while she was with him? The questions swirled, but I pushed them aside. It didn't matter what she felt. What mattered was what I was going to do. I slipped inside quietly, careful not to wake her. The house was dark, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock in the living room. I poured myself a drink, downing it in one gulp, the burn of the whiskey grounding me. As I stood there in the dim light of the kitchen, I made a promise to myself. They thought they'd won, but they'd only started a war they couldn't possibly win. I was going to dismantle everything they valued, piece by piece. By the time I was done, they wouldn't just regret what they'd done. They'd wish they'd never crossed me at all. With that thought, I climbed the stairs to bed, my mind clear, my purpose set. The fury was still there, but now it was silent, controlled, and it was going to be their undoing. When I woke up the next morning, the anger was still there. It wasn't the kind of emotion that fades after a good night's sleep. It was sharper now, more focused. The house was still quiet, Claire's absence like a shadow that refused to leave. She must have left early, as if her usual routine could wipe away the stench of betrayal that still clung to her. Fine. Let her think I was oblivious. I'd let her play the doting wife a little longer. I poured myself a cup of coffee, staring out the window at the rain-soaked street. My mind was already working through the first steps. Claire and David had blindsided me, but they didn't know that the tables had already started to turn. They thought they were clever, sneaking around behind my back. But I'd show them what real cleverness looked like. David. The name alone brought a sour taste to my mouth. My so-called best friend. The man I'd trusted, shared laughs with, and confided in. He'd taken more than my trust. He'd taken what was mine. But David had a weak spot. Her name was Evelyn. Evelyn and David had been married almost as long as Claire and I. They had the kind of suburban dream life that made them the golden couple of our social circle. The house, the kids, the picture-perfect Christmas cards. But I'd always noticed something in Evelyn, something David probably overlooked. A quiet sadness, an unspoken vulnerability. She was the type of person who never spoke too loudly, who always smiled even when you could tell she wasn't happy. I'd seen the way David treated her, dismissive at best, condescending at worst. She deserved better, and I was going to make sure she got it. Not because I cared about Evelyn, not in the way I was supposed to, but because she was the perfect key to dismantling David's life. The first move was simple. A text. Casual. Harmless. The kind of thing a friend might send. Nothing that would raise suspicions. I typed it out quickly, letting my instincts guide me. Hey, Evelyn. Just checking in. How's everything going? Haven't seen you guys in a while. I hit send before I could overthink it. It didn't take long for her to reply. Hi. Thanks for checking in. Things are okay, just the usual craziness. How are you? I stared at the screen, a small smile creeping onto my face. She was polite, of course. Evelyn always was. But I could read between the lines. Okay wasn't okay. The usual craziness was a placeholder for something she didn't want to say outright. Perfect. I kept the conversation light, steering it toward neutral topics. Work, kids, the weather. Anything that would make her feel comfortable, make her see me as someone she could talk to. And it worked. By the end of the exchange, she was thanking me for reaching out, saying it had been nice to catch up. Nice. She had no idea what I was doing, and that was exactly how I wanted it. But I couldn't stop there. A few texts wouldn't be enough to unravel the life David had built. No, this would require patience. Precision. Over the next few days, I made it a point to message Evelyn regularly. Not too much, just enough to keep the conversation going, to let her know I was thinking about her. I wasn't surprised when she started to open up. It was subtle at first. Little comments about how busy things were, how she was struggling to balance everything. But then the cracks began to show. She mentioned how distant David had been lately, how he was always at work or preoccupied with something else. I listened, or at least, I pretended to. I let her vent, offered words of support, made her feel seen in a way David clearly hadn't. And with every message, every carefully chosen word, I planted the seeds of doubt. It didn't take long before she suggested we meet up. Just a quick coffee, she said. Nothing unusual, just two friends catching up. I agreed, of course, hiding my satisfaction behind a polite response. The cafe she chose was quiet, tucked away from the bustling streets. The kind of place where no one would notice two people sitting together, deep in conversation. Evelyn arrived a few minutes after I did, her expression a mix of nervousness and relief. Thanks for meeting me, she said as she slid into the seat across from me. Of course, I replied, my tone warm, easy. It's been too long. The conversation started light, small talk about work, the kids, the weather. But I didn't have to steer it far before she started to open up again. This time, her words carried more weight. Sometimes I feel like David and I are just coexisting, she admitted, her eyes dropping to the coffee cup in her hands. Like we're not even partners anymore. I nodded, keeping my expression carefully neutral. I'm sorry to hear that, Evelyn. You deserve better. She looked up then, her eyes meeting mine. There was a vulnerability there, a quiet plea for validation, and I gave it to her, my voice steady, reassuring. You're not alone, I said. If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here. Her smile was small, hesitant, but genuine. Thank you, she said softly. That means a lot. As we parted ways, I couldn't help but feel a surge of satisfaction. The first move had been made, and it had gone exactly as planned. Evelyn was starting to lean on me, starting to see me as more than just her husband's friend. David had taken something from me. Now I was taking something from him. And this was only the beginning. When you know someone's weaknesses, it's like holding the keys to their life. David had been my best friend for years, which meant I knew him better than he knew himself. He was arrogant, overconfident, and utterly blind to the cracks in his own life. And Evelyn, she was one of those cracks. A gaping wound he hadn't bothered to tend, too focused on his own ego to notice the damage he was doing. Now, she was becoming my greatest weapon. After our coffee, I started increasing my presence in Evelyn's life, carefully, subtly, so she wouldn't suspect my intentions. The trick was to never come on too strong. I didn't want to be a hero swooping in to save her. No, I wanted her to feel like she was the one reaching out to me, like she was the one making the choice. People trust their own decisions more than they trust the actions of others. It started with little things. A text here, a quick phone call there. Each interaction was designed to deepen the connection, to make her feel seen in a way David never had. I wasn't just Mark, her husband's friend. I was becoming her confidant, her safe space. Evelyn was quick to open up. It wasn't hard to see why. David had been neglecting her for years. He treated her like an accessory, something to be polished and displayed, but never truly valued. She told me about the fights, the silences, the way he brushed her off when she tried to talk about their problems. She was lonely, isolated, and I was more than happy to fill the void. I remember one particular evening when she called me out of the blue. Her voice was shaky, hesitant, like she wasn't sure if she should be reaching out. "Mark, I hope I'm not bothering you," she began. "Not at all," I replied, keeping my tone light. "What's going on?" She sighed heavily. "It's just, David's been distant again. I tried to talk to him, but he just got defensive. I feel like I'm talking to a wall." I let the silence hang for a moment before answering. "I'm sorry, Evelyn. You deserve to be heard. Have you thought about what you need in all of this?" The line went quiet for a few seconds, and then she said softly, "I don't even know anymore." There it was. That flicker of doubt, that uncertainty. It was exactly what I needed. "Well," I said, keeping my voice steady, "if you ever need to figure it out, I'm here. No pressure, no judgment." She thanked me, her voice laced with a gratitude that almost made me laugh. If only she knew how calculated my words were, how every sentence was designed to pull her closer. Over the next few weeks, I started to notice the changes. Evelyn was texting me more, calling more, leaning on me in ways she never had before. She'd ask for advice about the kids, about work, about life. And every time, I'd be there with the perfect answer, the perfect reassurance. I was becoming the person she turned to when David let her down, which was often. Claire, on the other hand, was oblivious. She moved through the house like nothing had changed, still playing the role of the devoted wife. She'd kiss me on the cheek, ask about my day, even suggest date nights. It was almost comical, how hard she was trying to maintain the illusion. But I played along. Why not? Let her think I was still in the dark. The longer she believed her secret was safe, the easier it would be for me to unravel her world when the time came. But Evelyn, that was where my real focus lay. One evening, I invited her out for a walk. It wasn't anything formal, just a casual suggestion after one of our many conversations. She agreed, and we met at a park halfway between our homes. The air was cool, the sky painted with the deep hues of sunset. We walked side by side, our steps slow, our conversation easy. But underneath the surface, I was carefully steering the dialogue, guiding it toward the cracks in her marriage. "It must be hard," I said at one point, glancing over at her. "Feeling like you're always the one trying, and he's just absent." She nodded, her expression somber. "It is. Sometimes I wonder if he even notices me anymore." I stopped walking, turning to face her. "Evelyn, how could anyone not notice you? You're smart, kind, beautiful. If David can't see that, it's his loss." Her eyes widened, a flicker of something, surprise, maybe even hope, crossing her face. "Mark, It's okay," I said quickly, cutting her off. "I'm not trying to make things harder for you. I think you deserve to know your worth." She didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. She was starting to see me differently, starting to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. When we parted ways that evening, she hugged me, a quick, hesitant embrace that lingered just long enough to make my point. As I watched her walk away, I felt a cold satisfaction settle over me. David had taken something from me. Now, I was taking something from him. But I wasn't just taking Evelyn. I was making her choose me. And the beauty of it all was that David had no idea. He was too busy living his lie to notice the truth that was unraveling right under his nose. This was only the beginning. There's a moment when a plan shifts from theory to reality, a moment when everything teeters on the edge, waiting for a single push to send it into motion. That moment came with Evelyn on a rainy Thursday evening. By then, the groundwork had been laid. She trusted me, leaned on me, and sought comfort in my presence more than she ever did with David. The cracks in their marriage were no longer cracks. They were fractures wide enough for me to step through. The rain had started earlier in the day, a steady drizzle that matched the somber tone of Evelyn's latest text. "It's been one of those days. Mind if I call?" she'd asked. Of course, I didn't mind. Her reaching out was precisely what I wanted. We spoke for over an hour, her voice soft but filled with frustration. David had canceled another dinner, claimed he had a late meeting, though she suspected otherwise. She didn't need to say it. David's lies were as transparent to her now as Claire's were to me. The parallels between our situations were almost poetic, though I knew better than to say so. Evelyn wasn't ready to hear it yet. By the end of the call, I suggested we meet. "Nothing heavy," I said. "Just some company. I'll bring a bottle of wine." She hesitated for a moment, then agreed. "That would be nice," she said, her voice lighter than it had been all evening. She didn't know it yet, but she had already crossed the first line by saying yes. When I arrived, her home felt quiet, almost too quiet, like mine often did. She greeted me at the door with a nervous smile, wearing a casual sweater and jeans that somehow made her look more beautiful than any formal dress could. Vulnerability suited her. It made her real, approachable, human. "Thanks for coming," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "It's been a rough day." "Anytime," I replied, holding up the wine bottle. "Figured we could both use this." She laughed, a soft, genuine sound that felt rare these days. We settled into the living room, the rain pattering against the windows, the dim light casting shadows that made the space feel smaller, more intimate. We talked about everything and nothing, the kind of conversation that flows effortlessly when two people feel at ease. But beneath the surface, there was tension, a subtle, unspoken pull drawing us closer. It happened gradually. One minute, we were sitting on opposite ends of the couch, and the next, the space between us had disappeared. She was laughing at something I'd said, her hand lightly touching my arm as if it were the most natural thing in the world. That single touch sent a jolt through me, a reminder that this wasn't just about her or David anymore. This was about me, about taking back control of a life they thought they had stolen. "I don't know how you do it," she said suddenly, her laughter fading. "Stay so, grounded through everything. You seem so strong." I met her gaze, holding it longer than I should have. "You're stronger than you think, Evelyn. You just need someone to remind you of it." Her eyes softened, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The rain outside seemed to grow louder, the world beyond the room fading into the background. I could see the internal struggle in her expression, the way she was fighting something she didn't fully understand. It was the same battle I'd seen in myself, the one Claire had never faced because she'd already given in. "Mark," she began, her voice shaky, uncertain. I reached out, placing my hand gently over hers. "You don't have to say anything," I said quietly. "You're allowed to feel what you're feeling." She didn't pull away. Instead, she looked down at our hands, her breath hitching slightly. "I don't know what I'm doing," she whispered. "I feel so lost." "You're not lost," I said, leaning in just enough for her to feel the weight of my words. "You're just starting to find your way." The kiss wasn't planned. It wasn't something I'd rehearsed or calculated, though everything leading up to it had been. It just happened, soft, tentative, like she was testing the waters of something forbidden. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Her lips on mine were warm, hesitant but not reluctant. It was the kind of kiss that held 1,000 unsaid words, 1,000 untaken steps. When she pulled back, her face was flushed, her breathing shallow. "I shouldn't have done that," she murmured, her eyes wide with guilt and something deeper, desire. I shook my head, keeping my voice steady, soothing. "Don't apologize, Evelyn. You didn't do anything wrong." Her lips parted as if to argue, but she said nothing. The tension in the room was thick, almost suffocating, and I knew she was waiting for me to make the next move. But I didn't. Not yet. "I should go," I said instead, standing and setting my empty glass on the coffee table. "I don't want to make things harder for you." She stared at me, her confusion evident. "Mark, I gave her a small, reassuring smile. "It's okay. We'll talk soon." As I left, I could feel her eyes on me, the weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air. She was on the edge now, teetering between loyalty to a man who had failed her and the possibility of something new. And I was the one who had pushed her there. By the time I got to my car, the rain had stopped, leaving the world quiet and still. I sat there for a moment, letting the satisfaction of what had just happened wash over me. Evelyn had crossed a line tonight, and soon, she would cross another. The game had shifted again, and I was firmly in control. The kiss changed everything. It wasn't just a step forward. It was a leap, a bold crossing of a boundary Evelyn had been hesitant to approach. I could still feel the warmth of her lips on mine, the hesitation in her breath as she pulled away, the way her eyes pleaded for reassurance even as they betrayed her guilt. I had done what David never could. I had reached her, and now I had to press further. The days after that night were a careful dance. I didn't rush her. That wasn't my style. Evelyn wasn't someone you could push. She needed time, space to reconcile what had happened with the life she thought she was supposed to live. But even as I gave her that, I knew the path she was on, because I was the one paving it. Every carefully chosen word, every perfectly timed message was another brick in the road leading her to me. She texted me first. That was how I knew she was ready for more. "I can't stop thinking about the other night. Can we talk?" That was all she said, but it was enough. I replied with measured casualness, keeping my tone light, reassuring, "Of course. I'm here whenever you're ready." We arranged to meet at the park again, a place that had quickly become neutral ground for us. The evening was overcast, the air cool but heavy with humidity, as though the weather itself was bracing for what was about to unfold. When I saw her walking toward me, I could tell she'd been overthinking. Her steps were slower than usual, her shoulders tense, her expression uncertain. But there was something else there too, something deeper. Resolve. "I've been a mess since the other night," she admitted as we started walking. Her voice was quiet, the kind of tone you use when you're afraid of saying too much. "I didn't mean to make things harder for you," I said, keeping my own voice soft, gentle. "The last thing I want is to complicate your life." She stopped abruptly, turning to face me. "But you have," she said, her words sharper than I expected. "Mark, I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I don't know what's right or wrong." I held her gaze, letting her see the sincerity in my expression. "You're not doing anything wrong, Evelyn. You're just finding what makes you happy." Her eyes searched mine, and for a moment, I thought she might argue. But then her shoulders sagged, and she let out a long, weary sigh. I don't even know what happiness feels like anymore. The admission hit me harder than I anticipated. She wasn't just lost. She was drowning. And David, in all his arrogance and selfishness, had left her there to sink. That realization ignited something in me, a cold, determined anger. He didn't deserve her, and she deserved to know that. Evelyn, I said, stepping closer, you deserve more than this, more than being an afterthought in someone else's life. Her lips parted as if to respond, but no words came. Instead, she looked away, her gaze fixed on the horizon. It's not that simple, she murmured. It is, I countered. When was the last time you felt like you mattered? Like someone truly saw you? She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence was answer enough. That night, I pushed the line further. As we continued to walk, I guided the conversation toward lighter topics, easing the tension that had settled between us. By the time we said goodbye, she was smiling again. Not the forced, polite smile she wore with David, but something real. And when she hugged me, it lingered. Longer than before. Enough to tell me she wasn't just crossing lines anymore. She was tearing them down. Over the next week, I escalated things carefully, methodically. I wasn't just inserting myself into Evelyn's life. I was becoming indispensable. When David was too busy to notice her, I noticed. When she needed someone to vent to, I was there. And when she started confiding in me about her dreams, her regrets, her fears, I listened. Not because I cared, though I told her I did, but because I knew it was working. The shift was subtle but undeniable. Evelyn was pulling away from David, emotionally detaching in a way he couldn't see but I could. She started making excuses for why she couldn't attend their weekly dinner dates, why she was too busy for his shallow attempts at conversation. And when she talked about him, there was a bitterness in her tone that hadn't been there before. One evening, she called me in tears. David had canceled their anniversary plans at the last minute, claiming he had to work late. He doesn't even try anymore, she sobbed. I'm tired, Mark. I'm just tired. It was the opening I had been waiting for. You deserve someone who makes you a priority, I said, my voice steady, soothing. You deserve to be loved the way you need to be, Evelyn. Her breath hitched on the other end of the line. I don't know if I'll ever have that, she whispered. You will, I promised. And I'll prove it to you. The words hung in the air like a challenge, one she didn't know how to refuse. She didn't reply, but she didn't hang up either. That silence told me everything I needed to know. Evelyn was mine now. She just didn't realize it yet. David had taken Claire from me, but I wasn't just taking Evelyn from him. I was taking his confidence, his arrogance, his belief that he could have it all without consequence. And the best part? He still had no idea. But he would. Soon. The kiss with Evelyn had been a turning point, but it was her confession a week later that shattered the quiet momentum of my plan. She was pregnant. Those two words hit me like a hammer, yet I didn't let it show. The moment she said it, her voice barely above a whisper, I knew the stakes had risen higher than I'd anticipated. It's yours, she had said, her hands trembling as she clutched her teacup. Her eyes searched mine for something, understanding, forgiveness, maybe even reassurance. But all I felt was a strange, cold satisfaction. I kept my voice calm, measured. Are you sure? She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. I've taken the tests, Mark. I've gone over the timing 100 times. It's not David's. In that moment, I could see the weight of what this meant crashing down on her. For Evelyn, this was chaos, uncertainty, and guilt all wrapped in one. For me, it was leverage. David, the man who thought he could take everything from me, would now unknowingly raise my child, or lose everything trying to keep his family intact. Does he know? I asked, though I already knew the answer. No, she replied quickly, her voice shaking. I haven't told him. I don't even know how to. I leaned forward, placing a hand over hers. You don't have to face this alone, Evelyn. Whatever happens, I'm here. The tears fell then, silent and steady. As she let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for years. I don't deserve this kindness, she murmured. It's not about deserving, I said softly. It's about what's right. I meant it in my own way. What was right was ensuring David felt the full weight of the betrayal he had inflicted on me. And this child, this life forming between Evelyn and me, was the perfect catalyst to dismantle his perfect world. The following week brought the dinner party, an event I had anticipated with a mix of dread and excitement. It was one of those gatherings that Claire and I used to enjoy. Laughter, drinks, shallow conversations with friends who pretended to care about each other's lives. Now, it felt like walking into a battlefield where I was the only one armed. Claire was as radiant as ever, playing the role of the loving wife with precision. She moved through the room with ease, smiling, laughing, even stealing moments to whisper sweet nothings to me. I played along, matching her energy, my mask firmly in place. David was there too, of course, his arms slung casually around Evelyn's shoulders as if she were a trophy. He had no idea how fragile his grip on her had become. Evelyn, for her part, was quieter than usual. Her eyes darted to mine more often than they should have, her smile faltering every time she caught my gaze. She was unraveling, and it was visible to anyone who cared enough to look. Thankfully, no one did. Halfway through the night, Evelyn caught my eye and motioned toward the kitchen. I excused myself, weaving through the crowd with an ease that belied the tension building in my chest. When I stepped into the quiet kitchen, she was already there, her hands gripping the edge of the counter as though it was the only thing keeping her upright. "We need to talk," she said, her voice barely audible over the muffled chatter from the next room. I closed the door behind me, leaning casually against it. "What's wrong?" Her eyes flicked to the door before meeting mine. "I can't do this," she whispered. "I can't pretend everything's normal while this is happening." This, of course, was the pregnancy. The secret growing between us that neither of us could speak of openly. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "Evelyn, we've come this far. You need to trust me. I won't let anything happen to you." She shook her head, tears pooling in her eyes. "You don't understand. If David finds out, if anyone finds out..." I reached out, gently placing my hands on her shoulders. "Listen to me. You are not alone in this. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Her tears spilled over then, her resolve cracking under the weight of it all. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this secret," she admitted. "You don't have to," I said. "Not forever. But right now, we need to be careful. For both of us." She nodded, her breathing uneven as she wiped at her face. "You're right. I don't know how I got here." "You got here because you deserve more than what he's giving you," I said firmly. "And I'm going to make sure you get it." Before she could respond, the door swung open, and Claire's voice filled the room. "There you are. We were wondering where you disappeared to." Evelyn stiffened, her composure snapping back into place as quickly as it had crumbled. "Just grabbing some water," she said, her voice steady but strained. Claire smiled, oblivious to the tension. "Well, come on. David's telling one of his ridiculous stories, and you have to hear this." As we returned to the party, I couldn't help but glance at Evelyn one last time. She was cracking under the pressure, but I knew she wouldn't break. Not yet. David's laughter echoed through the room as I rejoined the group, and I felt a cold smile tug at my lips. The pieces were moving, the tension building. It wouldn't be long now before the truth exploded into the open, leaving everyone in ruins. And I'd be there to watch it all burn. The days after the dinner party stretched out like the slow, deliberate ticking of a clock, each second inching closer to the inevitable. On the surface, everything seemed unchanged. Claire moved through the house with her usual practiced ease, smiling sweetly, texting me updates about dinner or errands, all while pretending her betrayal didn't exist. David remained the smug best friend, laughing too loudly at jokes and throwing his arm around Evelyn at every opportunity as if his grasp could secure a marriage already crumbling beneath his feet. But Evelyn was unraveling. The pregnancy was a secret she carried with the weight of 1,000 unsaid words, and every conversation we had made it clear how much it was eating away at her. She confided in me constantly, her texts and calls coming more frequently, her voice tinged with desperation each time we spoke. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this from him," she whispered during one late-night call. "You can," I assured her, my voice calm and steady. We just have to wait for the right moment. The truth was, I wanted the secret to linger, to fester. It wasn't just about David finding out. It was about when and how. The longer it stayed hidden, the more powerful it would be when it was finally revealed. Every day that passed was another turn of the screw, tightening the tension until there was no room for anything but collapse. It came to a head during another gathering, this time a smaller, more intimate affair at David and Evelyn's house. Claire was there, of course, laughing and mingling, pretending to be the perfect wife. David was in his element, charming the small group of friends with his stories and easy confidence. Evelyn, however, was quieter than usual, her smiles thin, her laughter forced. I watched her from across the room, noting the way her hand rested on her stomach, a subconscious gesture she hadn't yet learned to hide. When the opportunity came, she pulled me aside into the kitchen, her movements hurried and nervous. "Mark, I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice trembling. "He's going to find out. I can't keep lying to him." "You're not lying," I said firmly, stepping closer. "You're protecting yourself, and you're protecting this child." Her eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. "He'll hate me, and when he finds out about us, he doesn't deserve your loyalty." I interrupted, my voice cold. "David has taken you for granted for years. You've been fighting for this marriage alone, and he hasn't lifted a finger. Do you really think he has the right to be angry?" She looked down, her tears spilling over. "I just don't know how this ends," she whispered. "It ends when you decide it does," I replied, my tone softening. "You don't owe him anything, Evelyn. You don't owe him your life, your happiness, or your child." She nodded slowly, her resolve beginning to harden. "You're right," she said, almost to herself. "You're right." The moment was interrupted by Claire's voice calling from the other room, and Evelyn quickly wiped her eyes, her mask slipping back into place. I followed her out, my own expression carefully neutral. But inside, I was already planning the next step. The reckoning came sooner than I anticipated. A few days later, Evelyn texted me, "I'm telling him tonight. I can't do this anymore." My heart raced as I stared at the screen, a mixture of anticipation and calculation filling me. This wasn't ideal. I wanted more time to control the narrative, but it was happening, and I had to be ready. That evening, as I sat in my living room pretending to watch TV, my phone rang. It was David. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, it rang again, and again. On the fourth call, I answered, keeping my voice calm. "David, what's going on?" His voice was frantic, almost incoherent. "She's pregnant, Mark. Evelyn's pregnant." I feigned surprise. "That's great news, isn't it?" "She says it's not mine," he spat, his tone venomous. She says it's yours." The words hung in the air, heavy and satisfying. "David," I began, keeping my voice steady, "I think we need to talk." The confrontation was everything I had envisioned and more. David was furious, his face red, his fists clenched. Claire was there too, her expression shifting from confusion to horror as the pieces began to fall into place. Evelyn stood quietly to the side, her arms wrapped protectively around herself, her face pale but resolute. "How long?" David demanded, his voice shaking. "How long have you been screwing my wife?" I met his gaze, unflinching. "Long enough," I said simply. "Long enough to know she deserves better than you." The room erupted into chaos. David lunged at me, his rage blinding, but I was ready. I didn't fight back. I didn't need to. His wild punches and shouted accusations only made him look more unhinged. Claire, meanwhile, stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. "Is it true?" she whispered. "All of it?" I turned to her, my expression cold. "Yes." Her gasp was audible, and for a moment, the room fell silent. Then Evelyn spoke, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I'm done, David. I'm done pretending. I'm done fighting for something that's been dead for years." David's fury crumbled into disbelief, and Claire's tears began to fall. As I stood there, watching the lives of the two people who had betrayed me fall apart, I felt nothing but satisfaction. They had taken everything from me, and now I had taken everything from them. The storm had finally broken, leaving nothing but ruins in its wake. And I stood there, unscathed, watching as the people who had wronged me drowned in the wreckage of their own making.